So I want to begin telling a story, and the story starts 25 years ago in August 1987. South Africa is under a state of emergency. The national leadership of the UDF is getting rounded up. Somebody that is fairly famous these days in that picture. And the same thing is true in Pietermaritzburg. So we've got a complete blockout of news. There's police and army are going into the townships trying to do what they call as re-establish order. But despite all that, Pietermaritzburg is about to explode. Something big is starting to happen. I, at this very moment in time, 25 years ago, am hiding. I'm one of the few people that didn't get rounded up in that dragnet. But I'm also a political scientist at that stage. And I'm trying to understand in my thesis something about how the local government system works. And it's taken me a while to get my head around that because it is a complete and utter mess. So basically, here we have a diagram which explains how different people were governed. And if you are black, there are at least 4 different types of systems. Within these systems, there are different divisions, and there are different rules for different people within this situation. Even in the rest of the, it's called white South Africa, there are different rules. And what makes this thing really complicated is that the town that I'm studying, Pietermaritzburg, really has all of these, except for independent states, within a very small geographical area. So basically, you have white Pietermaritzburg, which is sitting there with most of the industries as CBD. You've got Colours and Indians bottled up into a much smaller area there, although there are more people there than in this area. You have Africans, there's a tiny little enclave of Savanta here, which is basically administered by the Natal Provincial Administration. And you get a whole lot of different areas that are administered in very different kinds of ways over there. One of the really important divisions, one which I will talk a little bit about, is that basically this is the boundary to the KwaZulu-Bantustan. Edendale, sitting there, is a freehold area, old mission land, which is scheduled for removal into Willem. But basically people who live there are ruled in very different ways to people who live there. So basically here you have chiefs, there you have landowners, and basically in these townships you have yet other systems of administration. What's really important is that basically you can't just decide to live where you want to, and how and where you live determines what kind of services you get and what kind of access you have. The Savanta area there has first dibs on all the jobs, so the job queue is supposed to start there, then these are next, then these, and these are at the tail end of the queue. And so it goes for education, all the other services. There's a strong hierarchy. Now, one of the things that happens in the system is that basically these divisions are introduced, you find that basically, obviously, the revenue that comes from these things gets used essentially here, it doesn't get used there or there, so that basically these administrations here are all bankrupt. And that is one of the things that has led to that sort of upsurge in the early 80s, the service delivery protests, the riots that essentially led to the declaration of the state of emergency. Now, one of the things that the state knows is that actually it's kind of really, by removing this leadership of the UDF, it hasn't actually fundamentally solved that problem. And one of the things it starts doing in this period, August 1987, is that it tries to fill the gap of the sort of political vacuum in these areas. And one of the ways in which it does that is that in the Edendale area, it basically starts arming local thugs in order to kind of essentially attack some of the youth activists that have been organizing in those townships. And they start going door to door, recruiting people for Inkatha, saying basically, if you don't want to join Inkatha, then you have to leave this area. And within a very short space of time, Edendale gets polarized. People who flee from these people go into adjoining areas, they set up defense committees, and what was initially an attempt to drive out youth activists soon becomes a full-on war. And it's a war which in August has just over 20 casualties. By the end of 1987, we are over 100 people dying in that month alone. And basically, at this stage, something quite dramatic happens. The fight which has been in this Edendale area mainly, suddenly the people who are living in this old tribal areas, the youth in those areas, they start asking, well, why are those people kind of not being ruled by chiefs? We are being ruled by chiefs, and in fact there's a war going on there. We don't particularly like the chiefs sitting on this side of the border. And within literally a couple of months, actually, in area after area, people kind of say, well, actually, we don't want the chiefs anymore. And the chiefs and the headmen kind of lose authority and flee, which panics the state completely. And they send in the army, they send in the police. They basically round up every young activist that they can lay their hands on. And that kind of dampens things down for a while, but not for long. So basically, by 1990, the war is basically being lost by Inkatha. And the final throw is basically when a guy called David Ntombela, who lives in this area, takes an army of several thousand people and marches them into Edendale Valley. He burns out this entire area there. 10,000 refugees get created within a space of a day or two, and then basically just launches a full-on frontal attack into Edendale. The war lasts 7 days. He loses at the end. He doesn't get into Edendale, but the body count is over 180 in the period of essentially 7 days. So that's essentially the pattern of the body count. And what is remarkable about that is that basically it's not being described as a war at the time. Although, as Matthew Kentridge, in his book on the conflict, says more people die there in a couple of months than in the entire Northern Ireland Civil War over 30 years, basically. So a couple of lessons that I want to draw from that story. So the first myth, which I think is quite a pervasive myth, is that South Africa at the dawn of the modern era has a functioning state. But if we mark a state as something which has a monopoly on the force of violence in its area, as something that basically centralizes authority, what we actually had here was a state that over this period fragments authority. It's actually trying to set up a whole lot of new little authority systems all over the show, which are competing with each other, and each of whom have a little claim to be able to do violence in their own way. So there were bits of it that were functioning, mainly the bits that were dealing with the white system, but the system as a whole was a complete and utter mess. And the task in 1994 was not to transform an existing functioning state, was really to create a new state out of all of these little bits and pieces that were there to begin with. The second point, which I will get back to later, is that institutions really matter. Those boundaries that were initially artificially created become really important. They change what people do on either side of them, and it even affected the way in which social processes happened there. And the third point, of course, is that we certainly don't want to go back to 25 years ago. So there is some kind of sort of like almost nostalgia for the bad old days developing, but nobody wants to go back to that.